we're going to dive into a piece of Vaera from the very, very beginning of Vaera that, because of the way that the commentary goes, it kind of requires us to go back into this week's Parsha. And I've really gotten into Ibn Ezra this week. I spoke about Ibn Ezra last night, and I've gotten into this particular commentary by Ibn Ezra that you'll see we're going to land on at the end today. And it took me on a tour through some stuff from this week, which means that I've asked that you either have a Chumash in front of you, or I'll walk you through these pieces from elsewhere. So I'm going to pass these around. They're, for no particular reason, not stapled. So I'm just going to ask, as you pass them around, that you take 2 pages. I think that's right. And then pass them down. You'll see there's a giant title on the, if you take 2 pages, then you'll see there's a title on the next page. Okay, so there's a moment right at the beginning of Parshat Vaera when God is speaking to Moses. Is it the first time when God is speaking to Moses? Is this, in Parshat Vaera, the second Parsha of the book of Shemot, is it the first time that God is speaking to Moses?
No, you have the burning bush.
No, you have the burning bush, and God speaks to Moses there, which is partially why we have to go back a little bit in a few commentaries down the road. But there is a moment. Yes, Kathy. Wonderful question. Does it say Vayomer Adonai or Vayomer Elohim? So in that moment, in chapter 3, you can already turn to it. In chapter 3, you'll see, this is where we're going to go. Chapter 3, you see on page 326, if you're in the Eitz Chaim, chapter 3, verse 1. Begins where Moshe is tending the flock, right, and of Yitro, who is his father-in-law, right, and he comes to Horev, which is Har Hashem. We know that, he doesn't know that, right? Har Elohim. Vayera malach Adonai elav. So an angel of God appears to him in a blazing fire in a sneh that was a nenu ukal. It was not consumed by the blaze, right? And he says, oh my gosh, this is amazing. Why doesn't the bush burn? And then when God saw that he had turned aside to look, God actually called out to Moshe, right? Vayikra elav Elohim mitoch hasnei vayomer Moshe. Moshe, what's that reminiscent of? Avraham. There's also sneh in that one, right? When he calls out to Avraham in the moment of his nearly sacrificing his son Isaac. And Moshe says back, Vayomer Hineni. By the way, exactly the dialogue from that moment of near sacrifice, okay? Vayomer al ti krav halom shal naalecha me'al raglecha. So don't get too close, but also take off your sandals. Rabbi Kligfeld actually spoke about that this morning. Ki hamakom asher ata omed alav admat kodeshu, because you're standing on holy ground, sir. Right? He doesn't say sir. I added sir. Vayomer anochi Elohei avicha, and he says, so God introduces himself. I am the God of your fathers, plural. Elohei Abraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. This is getting a little into what we're going to get into later, but yes, he does introduce himself to Moshe. He does say hi and introduce himself. It doesn't say Vaidaber Elohim El Moshe, but God is definitely talking to Moses, right? God says to Moses, I am the God of your fathers. right? So it's clear that God is talking to Moses there. He doesn't say the classic verse that we're getting to, but he does say, I am the God of your fathers. So we definitely have that. Okay, then we're going to go back to Parshat Vaera for a moment. Now we're back at the beginning of our Parsha. God spoke to Moses and says, Vaidaber Elohim el Moshe. Vayomer Elav. And he says to him, okay, now we get Vayomer Elav. And he says to him, Ani Adonai. I am Yud He Vav He. Okay, I am Adonai, however that is pronounced. Vaera el Avraham. I appeared to Avraham, el Yitzchak, to Isaac, ve'el Yaakov, be'el Shaddai. Be'el Shaddai. I appeared to them, Be'el Shaddai. What is Be'el Shaddai? What is Be'el Shaddai? That's what all of today is going to be about. Be'el Shaddai. I appeared to them, Be'el Shaddai. Ushmi Adonai. And my name is Adonai. Lo nodati lahem. What does that mean? Lo nodati lahem. I wasn't known to them. And the translation here was added, I wasn't known to them as Adonai. Some would say I wasn't known to them as Adonai. Some would say I wasn't known to them in El Shaddai, as El Shaddai. Who is El Shaddai? Let's figure this out. The Or HaChaim. So I'm bringing in this late commentary, this 18th century commentary. I'm bringing this late commentary who comes in and offers something really simple. I wanted to start with the very simple. So the very simple commentary that's brought here is God here wants to make clear that God introduces God's self to people, even special people of each generation, individually. Okay? Nobody gets the same introduction that someone else in a different generation got. So what does this commentary say? Ta'am shehiskiram bifratot. So the reason that God didn't lump them together, but referred to each one by names, is that he was known on something special, something unique to that patriarch who was in question. El Avraham, Abraham was unique in that he recognized his creator without having been guided to that particular moment, right? What is particular about Avraham, or Avram, as what he was when he met God? Midrash is that he destroyed the idols. Who told Abraham, you should believe in God? Right. No one told Abraham he should believe in God, or Avram he should believe in God. He just believed in God. He is. He's the founding father. I like that, right? He's the patriarch who figured it out from the beginning, right? So if, or Chaim says, someone has foreknowledge of the existence of God and God's power, he doesn't get special credit for conducting themselves with such knowledge. So every intelligent being would choose good over evil once they know. Do we agree with that? I don't necessarily agree with that, but I do agree with the Reisha, not the Seifa. Okay, with the first part, not the second part. I agree with the first part, which says Avraham should get special credit and should be listed separately, meaning what Or Chaim is picking apart here is, why does it say in this verse, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov? Or for that matter, why does it say in our prayer services, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov? Why bother saying that? Why bother saying, I introduced myself individually to each person? Well, because the relationship was entirely different to each of those individual people. I am not just the God of all Elohei Avicha. Remember, now you guys got the tease. I was going to bring that in here, but you saw it earlier. He said, I am Anochi Elohei Avicha, right? That's what God said earlier at the bush. I am the God of your forefathers. But here God says, well, but let me get a little more specific. I was a God who met Abraham. And then later, I was a God who met Isaac, right? It's his reference sheet, as Irv says. It's like each time I met up with and created a special relationship with each of these forefathers. Who would you say, let's just get creative here for a second. Who feels missing from this list for you? I would say specifically Rivka for me. Specifically Rivka, because they definitely knew each other, right? She went to him and she was Lidroshat Hashem. She definitely knew God. We know that explicitly from the text. So just interesting who gets introduced in the text here in particular. Yeah. It's history rather than her story, says Irv. Yes, Kathy. Oh, I like this as well, right? So Kathy says, listen, God is changed every time God meets up with someone. God is like Shivim Panim LaTorah. There's 70 faces of God. God has so many evolving and changing aspects to God. Every time God meets with a human being, this is a little deep, right? But God is different in meeting up with that human being. So that connection is searingly different at each of those moments for God as well. I like that a lot. Barry, you're going to get the last point, and then I'm going to go to the next commentary. Each L is different, and it's the same God, but it's a different human. You're right. Right. No need to repeat the name of God every time, but rather we just repeat the different people with whom God has a relationship. That's beautiful. Sure, Sandra, you can jump in too. Mhm. Great question. Where does Kel Shaddai come in? Where does El Shaddai, this idea, come in? Where does it first appear? Where is this idea? The first place, at least where it appears in Shemot, is here. And I am going to make an argument, and you'll see where and when in just a few minutes, that I really hope that we get through in time. Otherwise, we'll be here all night. Why it's only important as to how God is referenced in Shemot. It's not my argument, it's a commentator's argument. I'm standing on the shoulders of someone else's argument, but this is the oh right, that El Shaddai. Speaking of that El Shaddai, turn the page to Sforno's commentary, our 15th century Italian friend, going back in time a little bit. And we're just going to look at the beginning of his commentary, who says, that bet, what the heck is that bet doing there? Okay. Ushmi Hashem, okay. My name is Hashem, lo nodati, didn't know me. Look at the verse again. Right? So what, yeah, Bet El Shaddai. So it says, and I appeared to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, Be El Shaddai. So what is this Be? He says, Be, the bet, Be El Shaddai, Nimshachat Letevat Ushmi. Tevat means either ark or word. Okay, so it is connected to this word Ushmi. So it's Be Shmi. So it's applying to the word Shmi. So it's like it's Be Shmi. So El Shaddai is the name. So El Shaddai, so it's, let me reread the verse with it. Vaera el Avraham, el Yitzchak, el Yaakov, El Shaddai, Bishmi Adonai. So he's saying that it's not that the bet actually belongs there and it was put in the wrong place. He's saying he introduced them, God introduced God's self with the name El Shaddai, right, with that name, and that the bet is just sort of oddly placed in that place. In effect, I'll read the translation just for this. We're going to run out of time so fast. In effect, what God is saying is that God has not made a point of becoming familiar to the patriarchs by God's attribute Hashem when appearing to them by Yud He Vav He, such as in the example mentioned. The question is El Shaddai a place, or is El Shaddai a name? Is El Shaddai a place, or is El Shaddai a name? Be El Shaddai. If you were to ask me, by the way, this would also be a very easy scribal error. It could have been Ke El Shaddai, as El Shaddai. That's just me speaking as somebody who studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary. I haven't asked any of my professors about it, but as El Shaddai would make a whole lot of sense here as well. Yes. Mm-hmm. So when is El Shaddai used and when is Yud He Vav He used? We're going to get there in a commentary in just a minute. So when are each of these names used? Like, is El Shaddai used as a name? Is it not used as a name? Right? Is it a place? Does it show up as a place? How do we know? What are we basing this on? But clearly, Sforno is basing this on the notion that he thinks that it's a name, right? Bishmi El Shaddai. He thinks that it's Bishmi El Shaddai, but the bet is placed in an odd place in the sentence. Okay, go to Rabbeinu Bachya on Shemot on the 3rd chapter, which is not in Vaera. It's in this week's Parsha in Shemot. So go back to Shemot, chapter 3, verse 15, which is on page 320. 330. Okay, 330 and 331. Okay. So Rabbeinu Bachya says, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. In this moment, when God says, you should tell the Israelites, Ehyeh sent me to you, because I am Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, I will be what I will be. And God said further to Moses, thus you shall say to the Israelites, El B'nai Yisrael, Adonai Elohei Avotechem, the God of your fathers, Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov, Shalachani Alechem, Ze Shemi Leolam, V'ze Zichri Ledor Dor. So this is my name forever, and this is my remembrance from generation to generation. So Rabbeinu Bachya says, this kind of a list, this is the list by which I will be known. I will be known by Elohei Avraham, Elohei Yitzchak, Elohei Yaakov. I will become known as the God of ancestors in a chain like this. Go to the end of the commentary, though. Another example, V'chein b'sefer Micha, V'eshlach lefanecha et Moshe, Aharon, uMiriam. Yet another example, Rabbeinu Bachya says, of the list of people who come. Why can God not be introduced, though? Why can God not say to Moshe, go to the Israelite people, to Bnei Israel, and say, I am the God of Moshe, Aharon, uMiriam? They have no idea. They have no experience at all. And actually, think about this for just a second. They have no recent connection whatsoever with Abraham, with Yitzchak, and with Yaakov. So Irv wants to believe that there is a lineage, and it's a strong one, and that generation that was enslaved down in Egypt, they were holding tight. Right. 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 And I find that there's a reintroduction here that's happening that seems to be playing deeply on the fear perhaps that God has, that maybe you're right, Irv, and maybe I'm right. Like maybe it's true that they still absolutely have this connection to the notion that this is the God of their ancestors. Or maybe they're slaves down in Egypt and they are living the worst life possible and feel very distant from any God that they may have cried out to. Because at the bush, we've just heard, they've been crying out. Now, finally, their God has heard them. So God's saying to Moshe, go to them and say, this is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, your ancestors. I've heard your cry. It's a tough sell, right? It's a tough sell. Go ahead, Irv. Yeah. We are honoring Martin Luther King Jr. on Monday. Great. I love that idea. Surely somewhere there was a kernel of hope. If we know that in the enslaved tradition in the American South, which is much more recent history by comparison, by hundreds of years rather than thousands of years, that we know that there was memory of the biblically captured, no pun intended, story of Israelites, then surely there must have been a kernel of hope alive that this God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob might come and to rescue them. Yeah. That's right. The page is often ripped out of Exodus when slave Bibles were given. Yeah, that's right. All right, Kathy, you get the last word, and then one more Rabbeinu Bachya and one last commentary. Mhm. Great point. How do we know that this God that you say, Moshe, by the way, Moshe, you Prince of Egypt, you, who has now married a Midianite princess in the wilderness, how do we know that this God whom you've met is our God, right? So it is actually, it's like an inversion of the zechut, of the merit that we call upon God. God saying, I am the God of Abraham and Isaac and of Jacob. I love that. Like God is calling upon us the way that we now utilize that as a signifier of merit. God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, remember us. Right? And God is saying, remember me. I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've heard your cry. Beautiful. I really like that. Did I get that right? I understand that. Great. We're actually going to go right to the last commentary so that we can get through this just in time. So the final commentary on the final page. Okay. My favorite Ibn Ezra I found, and I couldn't disagree with him more, but it's actually the reason why it's such a treasured commentary. Okay. So this is his take on El Shaddai. So now we're traveling back to the moment in Vaera where God speaks to Moses and says, just so you know, I revealed myself to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, Be El Shaddai. So Ibn Ezra says, maybe what this meant was because bet can mean bet can be taken to mean as as an El, as a God, she, that is die, enough. And then he goes on to say that absolutely cannot be the case. God is never translated in such a way. It has to be adjectival. That's not a form that we read God's name in. And I thought to myself, Ibn Ezra, but that's such a great explanation. I love this explanation so much. We're going to read the verse in this way for a moment. Okay, so God spoke to Moses, Vaydaber Elohim el Moshe, Vayomer Elav. So God, Elohim spoke to Moshe. Vayomer Elav, he said to him, Ani Adonai, I am Yud He Vav He. Vaera, and I appeared to Abraham, El Yitzchak, ve'el Yaakov, and also to Jacob. Be El Shaddai, as a God who was enough. Ushmi Yud He Vav He, and my name is Yud He Vav He. Lo nodati lahem. I wasn't quite known to them. I love this read so much, even if Ibn Ezra disagrees with his own read himself about what this could possibly be. And the reason why I love this is that, again, we're talking about a moment where God is, just to reach into a little bit of theology, we are talking about a moment where we are acknowledging a God who has permitted God's people, to descend for hundreds of years into slavery. So this is that God saying, I am a God who is enough and will be enough. And so it creates this air of wonderment about how there will be repair in that relationship now in this generation. How will they be known? Will God be El Shaddai in this generation? Will God be the God who is enough to this generation? It's not a name, it's a quality of God. God is El Shaddai. God will always be enough in every generation. It's an ask of trust and a very difficult one. Does anyone want to offer any thoughts on that notion before we close? Does that make you? Yeah.
There are different, two different ways to go on this. First, that just by the name of El Shaddai, doing that notricus, but Shaddai,
Yeah.
that way is nice. But it's also, we learned in our Rashi class way back when, it was like there's no real good definition of El Shaddai. No one knows what it really means.
Right.
So you could also, some want to say it's Shaddai from Shaddai, it's a god of a woman's chesed, mercy, rachamim, rachamim, rechem, womb is related to that, and Adonai is viewed as the sense of mercy, whatever we do is justice. Some say that El Shaddai may just be like more of a rock or a picture or something that's set. There are some other definitions as well, but there's nothing that's set. But what's interesting through all this is that we're told that he appears now to Moses as Adonai. He didn't appear to those others before. But in fact, he did appear as Adonai in Bereshit. He does that. And Rabbi Klickfeld came up with the following. He said, well, it may be that, yes, they may have appeared, but they didn't fully experience his presence as Adonai, as a God of mercy. And it's not until that the Jews, Bnei Israel, are actually redeemed from Egypt that can say, yes, we now know Adonai as the God of mercy who is able to redeem.
So I'm not going to be able to repeat that word for word, but Alan, you're right. It is, first of all, a lovely idea of a notre kuno, an idea of splitting a word so that you can create new meanings out of it. And second of all, it is such an oddity that God would say in the text that they didn't know God as Adonai, because of course they did. So how do we go about explaining? And I know the Rabbi Klickfeld has tried to explain it in this such a way in Rashi class and other places that perhaps they really didn't quite understand every one of God's qualities before. For me, and I think this is where I'll leave this off, and I think that this is a terrific place to leave this on Martin Luther King Jr. Day weekend. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day weekend. Lots of titles. God is only part of the equation. God is tapping Moshe as a prophet, but a very particular kind of prophet. As a prophet of, God is trying to turn Moshe into a nonviolent leader. It is a moment where God is taking Moshe, who killed a man in anger, and turn him into somebody who is lacking confidence and turn him into a confident, nonviolent leader of a people. And what I read this as is a commentary. And again, remember, Ibn Ezra doesn't like this read of the El Shaddai that he creates, but I do like it. I like the idea that God is enough in this situation. People play an enormous role. Right? God only plays so much of a role. The late great rabbi of VBS, I have brain fog right now. Rabbi Schulweis, thank you. Rabbi Harold Schulweis had a wonderful saying. He taught that there is no singular word in Hebrew for miracle. There's no one word. We have lots and lots. We have niflaot, we have nes, we have all sorts of words, and each of them represent different types of coming out of what would seemingly be impossible situations. The story of the Exodus of Egypt, which begins here with tremendous oppression, it does take the intervention of God, according to our text here, but it takes enormous human intervention as well. So what I take that read as is God is making a promise that God will be El Shaddai to the people. God will be enough to them in this story, and is making a promise that God has heard their cry, but the people will also have to play an enormous role in this as well. What's that? No, I mean, I'm glad you can sleep better at night with that explanation. We live in a world. Thomas Jefferson had a way of looking at the Bible, a deist Bible. I don't know if you know about this. Had a way of looking at the world. He really believed that God had made the world and then walked away, so to speak. Right? Really, really believed that. There are people who believe that God is completely non-interventionist in the world as it is today. And when I go back and I read the Exodus story, it's hard for me to go back into the world of playing with God being an interventionist in the world. But when I put myself in it, as I'm supposed to do as a Jew, and really read the Exodus story, putting myself in it, I do want to be there. I do want to remember that this Pesach. I want to believe that God will be El Shaddai. I do want to believe that there's just enough God, that there's just enough of whatever it is in the world that will help the human being leaders on this planet, that will nudge the unwilling but needed and talented leaders to step up as they need to step up, right? And so on and so forth. So may it be that we are in a world where we have a God who is El Shaddai, a God who might be admittedly fallible, as is the case in this story. And may we be open to new reads always of the story, because it's the only thing that keeps this interesting. So thanks for coming along for this ride today.